Hey, this is Shane Long, wedding and portrait photographer based out of Minnesota and Southwest Florida. I couldn't be more excited for today's video because today I'm checking out my brand new RF 50mm 1.4L VCM. I'm going to compare it to the 50mm 1.8 and the 50mm 1.2. We'll take a look at the background blur, the sharpness, the autofocus, and a whole lot more. All right, here we go.
It is really nice now that Canon has 3 RF 50mm lenses. It gives different budgets access to this amazing focal length. They each have some strengths and some weaknesses, which I hope to cover in this video to hopefully help you make the right choice right away. Let's start by examining what the background blur looks like on each of them. The photos flagged in blue are taken with the new RF 50mm 1.4 VCM. The ones taken in red are taken with the more expensive RF 50mm 1.2, and the ones taken in yellow are taken with the least expensive, the RF 50mm 1.8. One of the first things I look for when I purchase a wide aperture lens is the nuances of its background blur. I set up a tripod in a few different settings so that we could take a look at how this 50 compares to Canon's other offerings. One thing you will see right away is that the RF 50mm 1.2 is slightly more zoomed in to the 1.4 and the 1.8. I did see a patent on CanonRumors.com that said that the new RF 50mm 1.4 was more of like a 48.5. So that could be the case here. Maybe the 50mm 1.2 is more like a 51 or a 52mm. So they are slightly different focal length, and thus you will notice that the subjects in my photos are slightly larger in the 50mm 1.2 photos. Let's start by comparing the RF 50mm 1.4 to the 50mm 1.2. Just by taking a look at the photos, you will notice the background blur is larger, the bokeh circles are bigger. If we zoom in and look at individual elements, you will see that everything is larger in this photo. Though I will say that in terms of smoothness and kind of the way the elements are looking in these photos, they look very, very similar here. Here now you'll be able to see the difference in the size of the bokeh between the 50mm 1.4 and the 50mm 1.8. If we zoom in and look at those elements, you will notice that the 50mm 1.4 does have larger circles in the background here compared to the 50mm 1.8. Basically what we have going on here is small, medium, and large. As we scroll through the photos, you will see that of the three, the 50mm 1.8 has the smallest and least smooth background blur. If you look up in the corner, you'll notice it gets a little bit noisy up there. The 50mm 1.4 has medium-sized and very smooth bokeh. The 50mm 1.2 has the largest and the most smooth. I like the movement in all three, how the background blur kind of swirls around the subject. So you do get that in all lenses. I know some people don't prefer that, but I personally like that look. If we stop down to f2 to compare them all at the same aperture, we'll notice a couple things. First of all, the aperture blades become more apparent in the 50mm 1.2, part because it's closed down the most. And second, though it is close, the 50mm 1.2 still has the largest bokeh, maybe because it's the most zoomed in. If we switch here and put the 50mm 1.8 to the 1.4, we'll notice they have a pretty similar look to them. That said, because this one has stopped down the least, it still looks very similar to how it did at 1.8. I wanted to test the minimum focus distance of each lens, so I took the Nutcracker and brought him as close as I could to each lens so we could see how they perform. The 50mm 1.4 actually did the worst here. This was taken at its minimum focus distance, and you can see the magnification there. Now we'll flip. This is the 50mm 1.2, and it can come in a little closer to the subject. And now the 1.8. So the 1.8 actually did the best in this test. If you're looking to do up close work, that might be a great option for you.
All right, yesterday when I started recording the video, we didn't have any snow at all, and today we got a snowstorm. So it's the perfect opportunity to bring the new 50mm out here and take some photos with it.
These photos were all taken with the new 50mm at 1.4. And though not mind-blowing background blur, I think the 1.4 has beautiful bokeh and plenty of it, especially when not directly compared to the 50mm 1.2. This lens is smooth, artistic, and dreamy. High marks here in my opinion. Though I am by no means a videographer, I wanted to get some video footage too so you could see live what the background blur looks like. I took it outside to capture my daughter in the snow, and I think it handles it really well here. Then we took it back inside and she got out her pet hamster Coconut, and we had fun capturing some photos and videos of him with the Christmas lights in the background. I want to jump in quick and say that if you are considering buying any of the gear mentioned in this video, I would love if you use the links down in the description, as it really helps support me in making these videos. The RF 50mm 1.4 really shines in terms of sharpness. I would say that it is on par with the 50mm 1.2. If we zoom in here on my daughter's eye, we'll see it is tack sharp in both photos with both lenses. Switching it now to compare it to the 50mm 1.8, you will see that you get what you pay for. On high resolution cameras like the R5, the 50mm 1.8 shows up softer when photos are zoomed in. Out here, if we're looking at my son's face and clothing, we will see tons of detail here in both the 50mm 1.4 and the 1.2. The background blur at the same time, if we look at that, remains very smooth in both of these. The 50mm 1.8, however, shows it is much softer when photos are zoomed in. Outside here, if we look at my son's face, you will know that it is pretty soft, and we'll start to notice as we look at the background here is where the quality in the background blur starts to fade. You'll start noticing more purple fringing, and you'll notice the background blur starts kind of having these rough edges to it. I like that the new 50mm 1.4 is sharp in the center of the frame and near the edges of the frame. It will allow me to take group photos at weddings, and as long as everybody is the same distance to the camera, they will all be in focus at 50mm 1.4. Here are 3 photos I took at f5.6, and you can just see how much detail is in the trees. That said, most of these I took at f1.4, as that is where I was most curious to see how this lens performed, and I was not disappointed. The sharpness combined with the background blur creates a nice pop to these photos. Autofocus was one big bonus characteristic I wasn't even thinking about when I bought this lens. On this new 50mm 1.4, it is crazy fast, virtually instant. Here are some videos I took showing the autofocus speeds of each lens going from close to far. The 1.4 is very fast and nearly silent. It locks almost immediately. The 1.2 has more glass to move, and after using it for so many years, I was just used to it. It's definitely slower and louder with audible clicks that show up in your video if you're not using an external microphone. The 50mm 1.8 is the cheapest here, and it shows. It's the loudest and it hunts the most, especially if you're using single point AF. So for me, the new 50mm 1.4 is the clear winner here.
All right, now we're gonna test out the autofocus speed by having my son run full speed at me. We're also gonna see how fast he is. Let's do this. And on your marks, get set, go.
Here now are the photos of my son running full speed at the camera. Very impressive, all of them are in focus, even with me trying to record myself and take photos of him.
I've photographed sledding over the years with some of my camera lenses. The EF lenses couldn't keep up. We're gonna try it out with the new RF 50mm here and see how it can handle it. All right, here we go. Coming right at me.
Did you jump over you?
I did jump over you. One important tip I've learned photographing in snow over the years is it's important to close your LCD screen because it's a touch screen. Whenever the snow is falling on it, it starts throwing off your autofocus, and making it erratic. So by just using the optical viewfinder there, you'll have a lot better success with that.
And possibly even more impressive is how well the lens did photographing my kids sledding. While they're zooming down the hill full speed at me and snow is flying everywhere, the lens was fast enough to keep up with them and didn't seem to get too distracted by all the other elements flying around. That's also in part to the amazing autofocus in the new mirrorless cameras. I'm currently still using the R5, and I just couldn't be more impressed with the autofocus on that camera. I love that it enabled me to capture the kids even mid-air on their sleds going off a ramp. It just made this lens so much fun to use, especially when I compare it to my old EF lenses that couldn't handle a scenario like this. The sun came out for 5 minutes, and so I grabbed my 50mm 1.4 and we ran outside. I was just curious what kind of artifacts would show up when the sun shines on the front element of the lens. I prefer more contrast in my images and generally try to avoid lens flare, thus I use hoods all the time, also to protect my lenses, but I do like to backlight my subjects, so I want to know if the sun does end up hitting the lens, will it wash out the image, or will I have to remove artifacts in post? Looking at the footage, you'll notice a big red circle and some other elements that show up. The image does wash out when the sun hits it directly, but even with just a little angle to the sun, it does great. So I'm okay with this sun flare. It kind of reminds me of the artsy sun flare on the EF 50mm 1.2. The size of this lens was the reason I pre-ordered it on the first day. I already own the RF 35mm 1.4L, and when I got that lens, it was my favorite sized L series lens. So when I saw that the new 50mm 1.4 was essentially the same size, I hit pre-order now. My one gripe with the 50mm 1.2 as a wedding photographer is its size. With it being my primary lens for about 30 weddings a year, it gets heavy, especially when I want to load my bag with other lenses. The 50mm 1.2 weighs 2.09 pounds or 950 grams. This new 50mm 1.4 comes in at 1.3 pounds or 590 grams. This is almost half the weight of the 1.2. Then we go to the 1.8, which weighs 0.35 pounds or 160 grams, making it clearly the lightest. The 1.2 is a little longer, but where I notice the biggest difference is the diameter. This new 51.4 fits in my hand perfectly. The dials and the buttons give photographers plenty of customization options. I set the control ring to change the white balance, and I love that. Now that I have two lenses that have the button on the side, I might go ahead and map it to 1.6 crop or some other function. The dials turn with the quality you would expect from an L series lens. As a photographer, I don't use the manual aperture ring, but I do think it's pretty cool that it's on there for video. Let's talk about a few other things here. First, I want to talk about vignetting and distortion. This lens does have some vignetting and distortion, but those are automatically corrected upon import into Lightroom. Looking at these photos of me outside, this is the 50mm 1.4 and how it was automatically corrected for vignette. When I flip it to the 1.2, and the 1.8, it seems that those ones didn't have quite as much removal, as these corners down here seem brighter even though I tried to get the exposure the exact same. So it seems like with the 50mm 1.2 it leaves more vignette than it does with the 1.4. I might down the road go ahead and change my default because these corners seem just a little bit pushed too far and I don't want to introduce too much noise into the corner by pushing the ISO up there. Here's what the lens looks like with corrections on. If I uncheck it and go to what it looks like without corrections on, that is how much it vignettes. So it does have quite a bit of vignette to it. Let's compare it now to the 50mm 1.2, and just to be fair, that one also has quite a bit of vignette on it, and it does have some distortion too. You'll see that the image kind of warps just a little bit, and as we come to this new 50mm 1.4, kind of the same, about the same story here. So I don't think we should be any more critical of this one than we are being of the renowned 50mm 1.2. For me personally then, the distortion here is pretty minimal and it's basically automatically corrected, so this is a non-issue for me. When I released my 35mm 1.4 VCM video, many of you asked what I thought of the rattle. Truthfully, it didn't bother me at all, and it doesn't bother me here with this lens. It only happens when the camera is powered off or the lens is detached, and I can't think of a single time at a wedding that this has annoyed me. So no, I don't notice it at all. The color on this lens is fantastic. It has a great punch with all kinds of contrast in it. My copies of the 50mm 1.4 and 1.8 lean slightly more pink in them. When I compare my 50mm 1.4 to my 50mm 1.2, the 50mm 1.2 is slightly more green, whereas this one is slightly more pink. I don't know that either of those is better or worse, because either way I'm gonna pop over here and just slide my tint slider until I get, you know, just the right amount of pink in the photo that I like. So somewhere probably right in there. Since I first picked up a camera, 50mm has been my favorite focal length. Called a standard prime for a reason, the 50mm portrays the world in a manner similar to the human eye and thus has a very personal feel to it. I have owned many 50mm lenses, the Canon EF 50mm 1.8, a couple copies of the 50mm 1.4 EF version. AF died on all of those. The EF 50mm 1.2, the Sigma EF 50mm 1.4 Art, the RF 50mm 1.2 and 1.8, and now this new 50mm 1.4. Of all those lenses, I think this one is my favorite. Let's go ahead and summarize now the three lenses we were looking at today. The RF 50mm 1.8 is great for photographers just starting out, or it's great as a backup lens for wedding or other photographers. It is lightweight, making it great for travel. It has the best magnification ratio of the three lenses. However, it's the least sharp of the three and lets in the least amount of light. That said, it's a great first step up from the kit lens if you're looking to do some portraits. The RF 50mm 1.2 is the biggest and most expensive. Its AF isn't the fastest, but its build quality is built like a tank and will last forever. People buy 50mm 1.2 lenses to get in a lot of light and to blur the background, and that is where this lens truly shines. Of the three, it's the best at making creamy, dreamy backgrounds. And now let's talk about the lens this video was all about, the RF 50mm 1.4. It sits right in the middle of Canon's other two offerings. I personally think it's priced just right, and I think in a few years you'll find it a lot cheaper. Images turn out incredibly sharp with excellent background blur and blazing autofocus. For me, it's the perfect size and weight with extra dials and buttons that I can customize. I truly think Canon has hit a home run with this lens, and it has made me so excited for all my sessions coming up. Though the lens isn't perfect, I truly think it is a phenomenal lens. Down in the description, I will have links to all the gear I mentioned in this video. If you use those links, it really helps support me. Thanks so much for watching. If this video was helpful for you, please hit that like button and the subscribe button. We got a lot more fun stuff coming for you. We'll see you next time.